Hello to those of you who have joined us from the early morning panels, because this panel discussion or roundtable discussion is part of an academic conference, but this particular roundtable discussion is open for the public, and there are many colleagues here from Embassies in Budapest and various other newspapers, for instance. So let's hope that we will have indeed a discussion, because the very reason why, for instance, I just switched this off, because there will be no academic presentations here, but a discussion around the topic. The title is The Challenges of De-risking in Contemporary EU-China Relations. I'm going to shed light on this term de-risking in a minute, but first let me just introduce our esteemed panelists. Let's start from here. Here you can see Samuel Rogers, who is an old new guest at this type of conference, because when we started, it was 10 years ago. He was there as a PhD student, and it was one of your first actually, presentations at an academic conference, and now he's back. He's an esteemed scholar by now. He is now working at the Open University based in Milton Keynes, the UK, and he's a postdoctoral researcher and an ERC project titled Re-orienting Development, the Dynamics and Effects of Chinese Infrastructure Investment in Europe. So that probably explains the reasons why he's involved in this panel, other than he's returning to Budapest and he's returning to this conference. Another returnee is Professor Nölke from the University of Frankfurt, Germany. He's a professor of political science, international relations and political economy. And 10 years ago, we were also here at this conference and probably were responsible for one of the right? As far as I can remember. So again, this is an anniversary, and this is how we celebrate. We try to use him not only for the keynote speech, but also host him at this panel as well. So we have two academics, but the idea was, since the topic of the panel discussion is quite complex, that besides the academic aspects, we would also include the company level. And our idea was to involve even more company level professionals, but most of them who we invited are in China right now. And they decided not to travel back just for this very panel, but at least, and I'm very happy for that, we have here Csaba, who is now the vice president of SEMCORP Hungary Limited in Debrecen. This company, but you may elaborate on it a bit more, operates in the electric vehicle battery segment. They are not producing batteries per se, but battery components. And this is a very debated issue nowadays in Hungary. Some of the panels this morning have been focusing on this issue, and there will be some more panels focusing on this issue. So it is better to see not only the academic, but also the company level viewpoints on the challenges of the EU-China relations. And Csaba, by the way, has an experience in various fields, including in diplomatic relations, because he was representing Hungary in various locations in East Asia, including China, but probably also North Korea, if I remember correctly. So when it comes to risks, he's well aware of all of them. And then last but not least, we wanted to bring in a more policy type of analytical aspect as well. And therefore, we have here Varg from the European Policy Center from Brussels, Belgium. He's a policy analyst at EPC's Europe's Political Economy program. Since academics often speaks about, in general, about various issues, but they are not necessarily translated into the levels of policy. So therefore, it is better to have necessary to have a policy analytical type of aspect here as well. And by the way, the institution or the center he is representing, the European Policy Center, is also our partner in this very panel. So they help co-organizing this, and they help to bring in these fantastic panelists today. So the idea is that we indeed discuss topics related with EU-China relations. Originally, we wanted to just focus on challenges in general of the current EU-China relations, but then eventually we decided to zoom in on the de-risking. And first, I thought that everyone heard about de-risking already, but then it turned out that not everyone is aware of the very meaning of the de-risking, the notion of de-risking. So let me just briefly talk about at least the understanding I have or we have about de-risking. So de-risking is basically the European response to the decoupling of the US as regards China. So the US decision was to fully decouple as much as possible from China because it would be better without China in terms of economy, in terms of politics, in terms of whatever that is fully decoupled China, whereas the EU had to acknowledge that it won't be possible for them to fully decouple because there are some interdependencies, there are some sectors where it is absolutely impossible to do business without China, and there are some very important aspects, very important progresses there. The Chinese market, for instance, is a very essential element of, for instance, European automotive companies' strategy. That is, fully decoupling is not possible. As a result, their idea is to de-risk relations with China. That is, decouple in certain segments where it is possible, and in other segments, de-risk the relationship but maintain them. So that is the very idea of today's title, which is broad enough to encompass the current state of relationship, but it is also focused enough to set at least a few questions that help us to guide this discussion. So the three main questions we would have today: what has it really meant for Europe to de-risk the relationship with China so far? So what are the experiences? Was it successful or it wasn't? What is the state of play now as the new European Commission takes over, Trump being elected, Hungary becoming more and more open towards China, although the European strategy assumes something totally different? And what would be the renewed comprehensive European approach to China be? How it would realistically look like, according to our opinion, according to your opinion, because the idea is that after, let's say, 40 minutes or 45 minutes of discussion amongst ourselves, you could add your thoughts on that, you could ask questions and comment on what I've already said or what hasn't been said so far. So the first question, as I've mentioned, would be, and you don't have to prepare with huge opening remarks, just your thoughts on that. What has it really meant for Europe to de-risk the relationship with China? Do you see it as a successful attempt, or this is something that is rather dangerous? So I don't want to point at anyone. So if one of you feels has an opinion on that, then please go on. What do you think was success story or not so far?
I can maybe start just from the Brussels perspective. It's pretty hard, at least from Brussels, to tell if it was has been a success or not. I think probably people will say that it hasn't been a success this far. Our reliances on China going up, our trade deficit towards China is going up. We haven't really been able to create sort of de-risked, economically secure space for ourselves in these other chains where we wanted to, like batteries or chips and critical raw materials. There have been initiatives like the CHIPS Act and Critical Raw Materials Act that have tried to do this, but they have been more or less successful. And a lot of the projects that were really looked on as flagships, for instance, Northvolt with the battery value chain, are really struggling at this point. So I think at least the mood in Brussels is that we aren't really in a good place. Now with Trump as well, and things are really tightening. And the push now really is for the clean industrial plan, which is really a follow-up plan to try to salvage the clean industrial, clean tech value chain in Europe as it is. And then you have this push for economic security, which is really interwoven into the de-risking space, because it really takes all of the tools that we have spoken of as de-risking, now just talks about them as economic security. So that would mean all of these efforts to build up value chains in Europe, but also more offensive tools to try to stop investments from third countries, mainly China and others, like the foreign investment screening mechanism, the foreign subsidies regulation, which tries to stop subsidized companies from outside of the EU from bidding on contracts in the future. So there are a lot of things going on, but yeah, in my view at least, it's pretty pessimistic as of now when it comes to use. And there's really no coherent collective view on what it would need to successfully use from China as well. Would look very different from here in Budapest, I would assume.
So pessimistic, but no regrets.
Yeah. Well, I think there are some regrets as well. There are definitely costs to de-risk. For instance, every bid on a huge rail contract in Europe that the European Commission cancels or stops from a Chinese company means that you probably will have to pay a lot more for a European bid on it. So there definitely are costs to the de-risking strategy. That's really about how much suffering also you're willing to take to successfully regain some strategic advantage.
So we continue on this one. I will probably have a very different approach to this, right? This is some approaching it from the corporate side, especially working for a global market leader, Chinese company. Oh yeah, SEMCORP is not very well known for everybody, but SEMCORP was about 50% of the global of lithium-ion batteries separated fields. So a special product, it's like one of the four major parts of the lithium-ion batteries, and manufacturing this specific part, SEMCORP holds nearly 50% of the whole global market. So it's like in this segment of the industry, it's really huge. However, SEMCORP is definitely not as big as the big battery manufacturers like CATL or but a supplier for those companies. Coming back to the issue, I also see, especially when I talk to European companies, company leaders, which happens a lot because we are actually supplying European companies with our product. And I do talk about I do talk to a lot of European car manufacturers, even European battery manufacturers, and Northvolt. We talk with them, their clients, and I do see a very pessimistic atmosphere, but at the same time, and it's a very strong opinion of mine, and it is being proved every day that technologically China is ahead of the world in several questions. And we could think about de-risking policies, and we could think about how we can live without China, but I do believe that it's not relative, because if we want to live without the highest technological development, that means we are falling behind. So it's definitely not a good direction to like isolate ourselves from those developments. And if you just see, like about 40 years ago, what did China started cooperating with the developed economies, started cooperating with developed technologies, and now in a lot of fields like battery industry, like electromobility or semiconductors, they are ahead of or even telecommunications, they are ahead of the world technology, because they put a lot of money in corporations, they put a lot of money in research and development. But when I talk to European company leaders, manufacturers, what I see is that they see the future a little dark, but everybody agrees on that. For example, let's take the electric part. Electromobility is the future. Everybody says that. The head of Audi or Jaguar or any other OEM, they say that's the future. Now, how we will compete with Far East and East Asia, mostly Chinese manufacturers, that's the question. And if in the European Union, we set another rules and regulations, and we have to compete with China, which manufacturers do not have the same kind of strict regulations, then this competition would be uneven. So what I think from the corporate perspective, strictly, not political, corporate perspective, is finding ways of cooperation would be a lot more effective than thinking about de-risking or like isolating ourselves from this technology.
We have heard the policy and the corporate aspects. How about the academy? Yeah.
Well, I think I can chime in quite well with my predecessors, although I'm supposed to be representing the academic perspective. I mean, let us start with your last statement. I think also from, let's say, a global climate perspective. I mean, we absolutely need cheap technologies in order to combat climate change. China is providing these technologies, and it would be very stupid not to make use of it. On the other side, I think, and I would also agree with my first predecessor that decoupling so far, I always call it decoupling because de-risking is more or less a different notion for decoupling, a nicer notion, but sounds a bit milder or friendlier. But it is really about decoupling, and my impression is that we have only seen, let's say, the tip of the iceberg in terms of political activities, because there is clearly, and you can see this very clearly in Germany, there is clearly a very different position between business on the one side and let's say the political establishment on the other side. And as a political economist, in the last 40 years, I've never seen any comparable situation where politics points in this direction, business points in this direction. So the German government for the last years consistently has said, we have to move out of China, we have to decouple. And business says, no, we won't, we can't. And this is very, very unusual. We haven't seen it in Germany. Normally, Germany, there's a high degree of consensus between, let's say, establishment, the political establishment, or basically my impression always was the political establishment does what the economic establishment wants. But this seems to change now. Now, since I was already asked for the change of German government during the break, let me add a last remark on what that may mean in this regard. I think the new German government, which will be led by the Christian Democrats, will continue in the same direction as the previous one, but for slightly different reasons. Because the red-green government was arguing in favor of decoupling from China because of, let's say, issues of political regime. So it was about democracy and against authoritarianism and so on. The next German government will also argue in favor of decoupling, but not for these kind of reasons, but rather because of friendship with the US. The Christian Democrats are a deeply transatlantic party that has been the fundament of the foreign policy position, and it all depends on the US government. And if the US continues, and that's very likely, with a more or less aggressive policy against China, then the German government will follow. If the US government, if Trump has one of his transactional moves, then of course it will be easier. But basically, I would expect that this drive towards decoupling will continue. And the interesting thing is whether business will be able to successfully mobilize against.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting what just came before. I suppose, again, from a kind of from the position of the academy, quote unquote, if you like, I think the concept of de-risking is quite hollow. I think it's quite an empty signifier. So I think a lot of colleagues of mine, not just direct colleagues, but in the university system, if you like, are working quite hard to fill that with meaning. So it's a question, it's a little bit like, does the dog wag the tail or the other way around? But nonetheless, I mean, whether it is de-risking or decoupling, as we just heard, is a little bit of an open question, especially given the recent election in the United States and what that really means. But of course, this will have, this election, I mean, will have very likely will be quite impactful. But at the same time, I wanted to give a few kind of areas where I think this de-risking issue is gaining traction at different speeds, if you like. So first of all, I wanted to say that it's certainly a two-way street. So I've got some, can't help myself, so I've got some statistics here. And this again speaks directly to Germany, obviously European Union's largest economy. And so in Q2 of this year, 3.6 billion euro of investment into EU, it was the highest quarterly level for EU greenfield FDI in China on record. So, you know, this de-risking, again, to close a circle, we're not quite sure really what this means. Specific to Germany, the strengthening of German investment, 65% of EU FDI into China between 2022 and the first half of this year was German. And that's an increase from 48%, which was between 2019 and 2021. So again, that echoes what Andreas was saying. There is this quite clear split between, let's just call it briefly, German economics and German politics, to be simplistic. So, and then on one final statistic, the top 5 investors in China in 2023 were all from Germany. So, you know, and that does fluctuate slightly, but it speaks to the importance of the Chinese market. And then again, coming back to the recent election in the United States, I think an important factor might be around sanctions and what they call secondary sanctions, which of course speaks to non-US entities, and how, for example, German business, but obviously not just German business, might react to that, whether that's in the automobile sector or elsewhere, because it's such a huge market that they would be very reluctant to withdraw from that totally. So again, the split between de-risking and decoupling needs more thinking to it, which hopefully we'll be able to do that today. Another aspect I wanted to mention also was the kind of balancing of, I'm not very far from an expert on this, but the balancing of trade with human rights issues. So this speaks to, you know, rhetoric around the EU as a kind of values-driven entity, and what that means. Of course, you know, I'm working on some research at the moment about values from the EU itself. So it's very, they're also slightly empty, in my opinion. But nonetheless, this still, at the present moment, remains quite important with respect to China. But as time goes on, will the human rights issue, quote unquote, become less salient in EU policy circles? We'll have to see about that. And then a couple of other things I wanted to mention really were the kind of the diversification of supply chains. We heard in the first in the panel I'm a bit confused now, the room's been open, but I think it was over there. Yeah, about rare earth minerals and critical minerals, because obviously China holds the majority of that in the world. So, and these remain critical. I mean, we heard from Csaba about China being a technological leader. That's undeniable, but nonetheless, you know, markets in Europe are still very important for Chinese suppliers. So this kind of trade-off will remain, I think, an important aspect of, and a way to kind of fill, again, using the word fill, de-risking policy, if we can call it that. And then a final area is, and I think colleagues have touched on this already, is the kind of reducing the strategic dependence on sensitive sectors. So we heard already about telecoms, but I would also add healthcare, energy, and particularly transportation infrastructure to that list. And in my own research with colleagues on the project, which Ágnes mentioned at the beginning, a lot of our research is on transport infrastructure in Europe, financed by Chinese capital. And there are so many areas of Europe across the entire continent, including the so-called advanced countries, which have an enormous infrastructure deficit. And so how and who might pay for that has been an open question for a while, but as many people in the room will know, China has supplied a lot of that, a lot of capital for that over the last 10 or 15 years or so. Who will take this up if this Chinese capital would be reduced either by force or by voluntarism is an open question. But then you have these other non-European actors that are highly capitalized. And I'm thinking especially of the Gulf states and how they would or might, it's not a clean effort, but to kind of step in to fill the void. Obviously, it'd be a very complex situation, but I think that would also add another kind of dimension to this.
Thank you. What would you like to react?
Yeah, I just had a couple of comments. Firstly, I would just say that I really sympathize with you academics having to try to make sense out of these concepts coming out of Brussels, because of course we're talking about de-risking now, and it's sort of been subsumed under economic security during the latest mandate. And if you speak with Commission officials, they would worry up and say like, we don't know. We don't know what economic security means or what's in it. So it's really hard to get a grasp on what you really are supposed to do here. And I would also say that, as you said at the end about infrastructure, it's really under-communicated aspect of this, because of course you can invest billions in chips factories in Germany, but if you don't really have the digital infrastructure to even run fiber or 5G, then you can't really do anything. That is a problem across Europe. We have huge gaps in digital infrastructure that we don't really have financing at all, and it really is a problem for businesses. And then lastly, as you brought up, China, of course, is way more technologically advanced than us in a lot of green tech areas. And we have to ask ourselves, and it's not really something that is being discussed in Brussels either, and does it make sense to talk about overcapacity or competition from China when it comes to green tech? At least if we are to be like serious about our green transition goals, then could we really talk about overcapacity in green tech? Don't we really need just more of it? Just a couple of comments.
Yeah, let me comment just one thing Samuel said about the approach to the Chinese to the European market. He said that Europe is still a very important market for China. It is actually true. It is actually true that Europe is an important market for China, but look at it from the corporate point of view. Chinese companies are absolutely not worried about the de-risking the fleet of European Union or whatever European organizations. They are absolutely not worried about it. And why is that? It's because, but if you see just a few examples, SEMCORP has built a factory now in Hungary. SEMCORP is building another factory in the United States, which should be ready by next year. SEMCORP has just announced to build another company in Malaysia. Also announced to build a second factory in Hungary. Or let's see it here, a huge battery factory. Is building a factory here in Hungary, one in Spain, one in Turkey. BYD, the electric car manufacturer, Chinese company, building in Spain, building in Hungary, and also building in Turkey. So huge companies. So they are very, very optimistic. Whenever I talk to Chinese company leaders, they always say that in Europe, the world is big. And the ones who have their factories within the European Union, they are legally European companies. So whenever regulations you want to use for them or against them, you cannot use anything different than what you use for Audi or Mercedes or manufacturing was in Europe. Because the Chinese companies within the European Union, they have to follow the same rules, laws, regulations, everything. What all the European manufacturers do, they cannot receive any extra subsidies. They cannot employ people on lower wages. They cannot pollute the air more, or they have to follow exactly the same regulations. And if they are still more competitive than the European counterparts, then that's the nature of market.
So just to quickly sum it up, Brussels is pessimistic, China is optimistic. Where within the academic field, we don't even know what theory is. Yeah. Yeah, we still stick to that. Can be confirmed that. We still stick to something. Probably it is not just economic security that, for instance, people in Brussels wouldn't necessarily be able to define, but it is also de-risking. So it is not necessarily something that is properly defined, yet we are following that. And what is the reason for that? I'm not sure if there is an answer to that, or I'm sure that there is not one proper answer to that, but what is the reason why we acknowledge that China is leading in certain sectors, such as in telecommunications, in electric vehicles. We heard that for German companies, the Chinese market is essential. Yet we are striving not to deal business with them, at least not that much than before. What is the reason for that? According to your understanding, according to the corporate aspect, according to the policy understanding, according to the academic understanding.
When I have a very stable answer to that. No idea whatsoever why we are doing this. Look, I don't find any logical. I find particular reasons behind it, and I see the particular reasons that read and I search the particular reasons behind it. But actual economical reasons, I just don't get it. Like, for example, the new customs tariffs against Chinese vehicles. Who voted yes, who voted no? Why are we doing this? It's actually, it causes real damage to the ones who are supposed to be protected by it. Like the big European OEMs. They are all, actually, they suffer a lot of disadvantages because of this, because they might lose their Chinese markets, which is really essential for them. So, my straight answer to this is I have no idea why you do it.
I think for Brussels, at least, you can't really talk about this without talking about the shock of the Ukraine war and stop of gas from Russia. I think that really put into stark relief what high dependence in European countries do to the Union, at least in Brussels. And really, it was after that we started hearing more talk about de-risking and de-risking from China as well. Of course, you had a whole episode with Huawei and telecommunication equipment before that, but that was less on dependence and more about spying and stuff like that. But now it's more like, how can we live in a situation where we don't really have any access to critical raw materials that are needed in a lot of different value chains. And of course, you can agree with that or disagree with it, but at least the mood in Brussels is that we should have some sort of supply that isn't exposed to export restrictions from Chinese government or other hostile countries. But it's viewed as a strategic rival in Brussels. So it really stems from that, from my point.
And from a strategic rival, we should be risk yourself. That's the kind of understanding.
Yeah, of course, it's the aspect of the US as well. Of course, we have been pushing hard against China for a long time, and the EU is a close ally of the US. And when the US pushes, EU usually follows.
I would add another factor that is COVID, because during the COVID crisis, we have realized how dependent we are from certain global value chains. And I think this really marked some kind of an impetus for politics to get more involved with the economy, because before they have simply accepted everything what business has done, and as long as business was working properly, that was fine. But now I think at least some politicians have realized that that is something that in certain circumstances can be dangerous, and politics does not always follow the economy anymore as it did before. And for the European Union, of course, this is a particular big challenge, because the European Union in the decades before was really a machine for economic liberalization. I mean, the European Union was really the motor for economic liberalization. I mean, we have seen this here in this region. I mean, opening up was supported by the European Union. We have seen it in Germany. Germany, many of our old, let's say, social democratic institutions have come under under pressure from the European Union, because particularly in the 1990s, early 2000s, the European Union and the Commission, the European Court of Justice, very strongly in favor of economic liberalism. Now they have to do a U-turn, 180 degrees. It's very difficult for the European Union now to come up with something. But going away a bit from the political, I think there are also some long-term economic aspects. And I would argue, I mean, your original question was why is China leading in this field, and why are European economies falling behind? I mean, it also has to do with the long-term development of the German economic model, which is very strongly focused on exports, and particularly on exports, let's say, via low costs. It's not, I mean, Germany claims to be able to lead exports based on fantastic machinery and the best cars and so on. I think the last years have demonstrated that this is not true anymore. But if you look at in Germany, at the German economy, it does not invest enough in research and technology. It is losing its advantage in many economic sectors. It only looks at short-term costs, low labor costs, low energy costs, which is a long-term doesn't work out. You know, on the other side, we have China, which against many liberal observers has found some very interesting, let's say, state-led strategies to upgrade its economy and move into a higher technology. So I think this is also very important as a background for what is happening at the beat.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you. I suppose I would, to answer your question, I mean, it's a difficult one, I suppose, based on my own research, and for better or for worse, quite a lot of it has been in this country. So one of the firms that I've been kind of researching over the years has been Huawei. And people I've spoken to quite simply, it's a bit anecdotal, of course, but quite simply, they told me that they tend towards Huawei solutions because they're better and cheaper. And so, which ties in with what Csaba was saying earlier on. So, you know, that's just a kind of more of a kind of zoomed in effort. But then, you know, to speak about Huawei specifically in this country, you know, as I'm sure many people know, now we can call it Trump 1. At the end of that period, the Secretary of State was dispatched to tell all the Europeans they'd be very close, and they weren't allowed to use Huawei anymore, because if they did, then the US would not be able to spy on them as much as they would like to. And so, but then, you know, he didn't even waste his time coming to Budapest because that was not going to happen here. And indeed, if you see, since that time, this was in 2020, so 4 years ago, and even in the last 4 years, Huawei has kind of expanded its footprint, if you like, in this country. I'm not labeling this as good or bad; it's just the way that it's turned out. So, but then, you know, it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, this is just one small example, but we might see more of this kind of stuff, especially across the sectors which I mentioned earlier, including transport infrastructure, which we elaborated a little bit earlier. But we'll see. I think time will tell before we can really answer that question. Right? Yeah.
You've mentioned many external actors as well as internal actors, like the US, who puts pressure on the EU, and the EU follows. The COVID that was there, originating from China, by the way, but otherwise it became a global phenomenon. Then the Russia's war on Ukraine was also mentioned. And how about Hungary? Because you have at least touched upon the topic of Hungary. So how harmful or useful Hungary's role within this, let's say, complex question? So, for instance, it's harmful in many regards when it comes to this de-risking, which you do not even sure if it is just or not. But when it comes to the climate goals, the needs on the EU level, someone has to manufacture the vegetables, right? And from various points of view, from economies of scale point of view, for instance, it makes sense to have it within the EU. And I can see some intentional willingness of the EU banning the import of electric vehicles or imposing tariffs on electric vehicles, but not on electric vehicle batteries, because those are essential for the EU climate goals. So the next question should be about the state of play of the relations, but you have touched upon this topic from various angles, but how, since we are sitting in Budapest, how do you see from the policy, from the corporate, again, from the academic point of view, the role of Hungary? Is it indeed a major one, as we assume, at least in Hungary, or it's a minor one? It's useful, harmful? Or it's confidential?
Yeah, I can start. Of course, you hear a lot about Folkman and Hungary in Brussels, especially when there's like big decision, nobody blocks or extends or whatever when it comes to aid for Ukraine or something like that. But yeah, also now with Chinese investments, Greenfield investments in battery production here in Hungary and yeah, stuff like that. And of course, believe that the EU tariffs on electric vehicles is simply just to make the electric vehicle business in the EU able to flourish as well. I don't think necessarily that many economists would agree that that is going to be the effect it's going to have. But it's also about like making Europe, getting to the point where EU is taken seriously by foreign adversaries as well, like China, like the US. For a while, I think the EU hasn't really taken serious at all, and it's been part of the world that simply moved past. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is put more pressure on the battery value chain, battery investments as well. That will be said, I think, also that Chinese, there could come reactions from there, maybe curtailing investments in the EU as well. And yeah, I think these investments and factories can definitely become tougher problems in years to come than they have been up until now.
That from the corporate point of view, what the Hungarian government is doing with China in the field of economic cooperation is, I believe, is good for the country's economy, and it's good for the country's economy to not analyzing how is Hungary's economy now, or only just concentrating on this aspect, what is Hungary doing with China in economic cooperation. I think this is a good thing for Hungary. And why is it? We have the big German OEMs in Hungary. We have BMW, big factory, Audi, the biggest engine factory of Audi of the whole earth. We have a huge Mercedes-Benz factory in the middle of the country. One in the west, one in the middle, one in the east. These factories are employing a lot of people, paying a lot of taxes. They are feeding a lot of families, tens of thousands of families. And this is exactly what the big Chinese investors do. They build up big factories, let it be battery factory, or let it be an electric vehicle factory, or spare parts for batteries, or telecommunication, or whatever. They are doing the same things. And as I referred to it before, that once a company is built within European Union or in Hungary, the same rules, laws, regulations apply to them as to the German companies in Hungary. So it's just a market competition that for the country's economy, it's definitely good, because these big companies employ a lot of people. They practically feed a lot of families. They pay a lot of taxes to the government. So in my imagination, or the way I see it, it is good. Obviously, I'm not monitoring, when I'm saying this, I'm not monitoring what the politicians think about Hungary's economic openness to Chinese investors. But also when we start talking about that, we should remember the end of 90s, early 2000s, until, let's say, 2015, if you compare Chinese investments in Western Europe, Chinese investments in Central and Eastern Europe, you see a huge difference because Chinese companies in the first half of from 2000 to 2015, let's say, music was good for this. Actually, very, anyways, how much Chinese investment flew into Germany, to France, to the UK, to Spain? A lot, and almost nothing to this part of Europe. Now that really big Chinese investments are coming, billions of dollars Chinese investments are coming to this part of Europe and not to Western Europe. Now we start thinking about de-risking and how dangerous it is. Wasn't it dangerous between 2000 and 2015 when billions of euros of Chinese investment flowed into Western Europe? They actually purchased utility supplier companies in Portugal, Spain, Italy. They purchased factories. They even purchased football teams, real estate. Wasn't that dangerous at that time? Why is it dangerous now? So I think this is actually good for the country. To the point that is it okay for Hungary or not? I do think that for Hungary it is good.
Okay, well, I'm stable. Let me make two remarks. One, let's say, as a German on the panel, and the other one, the academic. Let's say, let me give you an idea about the discussion on Hungary and Germany. Nobody, at least my impression, nobody really is concerned about the battery production. In contrast, I think the business establishment is happy with it. I mean, there's a very interesting split in public debate about Hungary. On the one side, people are extremely angry about Hungary because of its political system, and on the other side, there's this very smooth cooperation in the economic. And over the last years, there was an attempt to link the two issues. So some people tried to mobilize against, let's say, our companies, but you're cooperating too closely with this terrible political system. But it didn't work out, and it was a weakening of the Green Party. No, I don't think this will succeed. So there is not a problem. Let's say on your question, what is in this for Hungary, and let's say from our academic perspective, I would simply say Hungary is changing one dependency for another. So before it was heavily dependent, and it still is very heavily dependent on Germany and German car producers. Now it will have an increasing degree of a dependency on Chinese battery producers. So it doesn't really change so much fundamentally. I mean, a different thing would be if Hungary would be able to link foreign direct investment with technology transfer. If it would be able to say, okay, you can invest, but only if we can see, a very substantial degree of technology transfer, and like the Chinese did, where you can only do investment in China if you undergo a joint venture and massive technology transfer with a Chinese company, and that was very successful, as the German car industry has learned during the last decade. So that would make a difference. But if you let's say complement existing or complement existing foreign direct investment from Germany with one from China, from the Hungarian perspective, it keeps you in the same medium degree of technology of independence status that you have seen during the last decades.
It was interesting how you described in your German hat Hungary's role. So it is viewed because of its political system as an enemy, I would say. But when it comes to business, that's pretty smooth and pretty something that we need, right? It would be quite similar if you had to describe China, right? In
a way, yes, but of course China is a different.
It's a different animal.
Just have a very short remark on that. You said this is a change of dependence on here. I don't think it's a change of dependence. It's like diversity of dependencies. Because we are still dependent on the German market. It's still there, it's still here, and it's still a major dependence. So if we are dependent, at least we should be diverse. That's what the government says about us.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting what came before. I'd like to say that, and as I kind of talk about my own work, you know, as a non-Hungarian who kind of comes in fairly often and writes about it fairly often as well, it's still quite staggering that such a small country gets so much attention in the scholarly and media world. You know, so it begs the question, why is that? You know, why is it not say Poland, which is 4 times larger, at least in population? And of course, you know, you can't kind of extrapolate the political side and this liberalism, so-called liberal democracy, which was announced already over a decade ago, as I mentioned earlier. So I think to be honest with you, I think a lot of people in the Western Europe just find that very fascinating and would like to see how this develops over time. And so in that sense, I might not exactly use these words in a real academic paper, but it's a form of kind of a laboratory to see what happens, how these you know, economic conditions develop under liberal conditions, so forth. So I think that's one part of it. Another part is the European Union is you know, it's forgive me, but it's often quite arrogant in the way that it others, especially the eastern and the southern peripheries of the European continent. If, so, you know, just to be hypothetical, if all of this action was happening in, say, I don't know, Belgium, you would not have, or I don't know, Denmark or something, you would not have nearly the level of pejorative language which would, you know, captured around that. So that is also, from my perspective anyway, part of the story. So this peripheralization of this part of the world. So yeah, and then I mean, of course, I'm not an expert on this at all, but about the battery sector, for example. But I mean, we've heard earlier in the first one of the first panels about the serious environmental degradation which accompanies these developments, and I don't think we should overlook that. That's all. That will always be part of the story. But then again, you have to, as Csaba was saying, you know, they do pay taxes. Families do incomes of that, and then they are consumers and they eat and whatever. So it's a complicated story. So I don't think it's a question of is it good or bad for this particular country. It's an ongoing dialogue, and again, I'm sitting on the fence a little bit, but it's. I think these are all aspects that we should consider. But certainly, just to re-emphasize the point, you know, this Hungary and the countries around in this region are continually othered, and we need to kind of think of that, take these arguments into consideration.
Thank you. One final round, because before we open the panel to questions and comments, and this is about the future potential comprehensive European approach to China. As we could hear, de-risking may be an ongoing process. Hungary potentially hampers the deepening of process, but not necessarily just Hungary, as there are some fragmentation within the EU in this regard. When we were focusing on Germany, we could see that there are two totally contrasting interests when it comes to the political and the business community. So what would be realistically the comprehensive approach towards China from Europe under such circumstances we have with Trump, with the war on Ukraine, and so on and so forth? So what could be realistically done in this regard? A total reversal, or going on with this and let's see what happens, call it what it is, an attempt for decoupling, which is not successful so far? What should be happening in the following, let's say, 4 or 5 years?
I don't know what should be happening, but I think at least there is a pretty significant danger that Europe is forced to move. Of course, maybe discuss if there's a distinction between decoupling and de-risking. Be forced by the US to move more towards the US style decoupling with China. It's because of the trade threats made by Trump already, and Europe has a very significant trade relationship with the US. We're very vulnerable to trade defense instruments being applied in the US, like tariffs against Europe. So if Trump really comes in and really puts actions behind his words, then Europe might have to go along to some degree with what is promising to be a fairly dramatic push from the US against China. In sort of the more policy-based Brussels scheme, then of course there has been developed a lot of tools over the last years that are, at least in theory, country agnostic. They aren't sort of defined as tools against China, but they are fairly openly discussed as tools to deal with against China. For instance, the foreign subsidies regulations that I mentioned, and the outbound investment screening, which is still in the works, and a sort of more comprehensive strategy probably just means coordinating all of these tools in a better way. For instance, when there is imposed tariffs now against electric vehicles from China, then probably you could use investment screening tools and foreign subsidies regulation-based investigations to try to stop some of the investments coming from China into Europe, to try to avoid those tariffs, to try to close the door more significantly. You would do a much harsher push to try to forge new free trade agreements with partners like Australia or southern Latin American countries. Then, of course, you move into the territory that Samuel was mentioning about our values and value-based approach to trade. That has often been a sort of a problem for the EU in striking fast and rough trade agreements to secure critical raw materials, for instance. So you would definitely see more of a clash of values versus economic security and the independence as well. That's a short word.
Yeah, I actually basically agree. Just from the economic perspective, I do not see a big future of de-risking those companies because it doesn't make any really serious point from the economic perspective. But I'm afraid that it will be based on political perspectives. US Trump policy, EU political approach. So the future, obviously I'm not a fortune teller, so the future of the risking, I cannot predict. But I'm almost sure, and I'm also very sorry, that in my opinion, it will be mostly decided on political basis. It mostly be decided based on Trump's policy to Europe, based on Europe's policy to the United States and China. Probably the Ukrainian war escalation, if it ever happens, might have an effect on it. So I do not see the future, but I am seriously worried that this de-risking procedure, or whatever we call it, will be defined by political decisions rather than economic reality.
A short comment there. I think somebody mentioned the huge amount of FDI going into China now from especially German auto manufacturers. Yes, Sam mentioned that. Of course, it's hard to say. We don't really know, but it's probably because they are preparing against the US tariffs, investing in China to sort of try to avoid the tariffs coming. So all over Europe, there are signs of people having to store covers. We can't be fortune tellers, but the signs of that. Right.
Indeed, I mean, we see this also with investments in the US. So I think that the big days of trade are over, and now it's rather moving to FDI in order to be able to serve the markets in these kind of economic blocks. But let me maybe move to the second part of your question. That's this kind of fortune teller, how it looks like, but also how we should move. And that what I would highlight is that we should, and I think it's not moving in this direction, but what we should do is to strengthen domestic demand because The European Union is very strong on limiting, let's say, public expenditure, including the last round of provisions of its public debt framework. But what we really need are heavy investments in technology and research and technology on the one side to keep us somewhat more independent from other blocks in the world. On the other side, in order to move into new sectors, probably we have lost the race for cheap electric vehicles, but there will be new products, and I think it's extremely important that we invest a lot. And this is only possible if also the public sector takes huge amounts of money into its hand to provide incentives to the private sector for research and development. I don't see this coming. I'm afraid that the German government will play a difficult role in this because Germany has this terrible tradition of frugality and this worrying housewife. But I think that would be the way to go. And otherwise, I think it's the European interest, it's the Hungarian, it's the German interest to keep the global economy open. I mean, this race to become number one or to stop China to become number one between the US and China is not our issue. We should try to avoid this conflict as far as possible. But again, the question is whether we can or will be forced. But I think if you ask me what we do, I think it would really to strengthen, let's say, the domestic market in Europe, to invest in technologies, to increase domestic demand, higher wages, and so on. So that would be it.
Yeah, thanks. I think it would be interesting to see, obviously it's so many open questions, but I think it would be interesting to see which kind of, to be as broad as possible, which kind of sectors would be privileged for sort of, augmenting risk strategies around. And in 2023, there was this economic security strategy when they identified 4 types of risks. So the first one was for the list: resilience of supply chains, including energy, physical security, cyber security, and critical infrastructure. The third is tech security and leakage, and the fourth is weaponizing economic dependence. I mean, some heavy-duty language here, but I think, and they, as usual, it's kept as broad as possible, so then you can kind of cherry pick what you'd like to put in there afterwards. And I think that's exactly the point. Whether they do go down this kind of critical infrastructure area will be quite interesting. We saw this, I mean, in my own research in Germany, for example. We've done a lot of work in Costco, and it's investment or reduced investment in Hamburg and also in Duisburg. But then in Greece, in Piraeus, they own 100% of it. So, and this again ties into what I was saying before about the peripheralization of the EU and this other ring. It's essentially kind of, I mean, the message is not really allowed to happen in the core heartlands of the EU as such. So this is, I feel that there will be these layerings of risk across the continent. It won't be nice, neat, concentric circles, but there will be different kind of stages of that. And this speaks to, I realize that we're not in a full academic moment here, but this speaks to Daniela Garbo's work on the so-called de-risking state, as she calls it, where investors are essentially ring-fenced to protect them and their capital interests. So that will play a role here, I feel. I think also a kind of an elephant in the room, if you like, we haven't really discussed yet. It's the role and increase of AI, and how that will play out, because obviously it's very fast changing field, and what kind of resilience to tie back into this European security strategy language will develop around that against threats and I don't know, enemy countries, that's the correct language, but countries like China, for example, and covenant countries as well. So that will be quite interesting. But again, as we've heard a few times already, the pending Trump 2.0 government will obviously play a huge role in how these things are shaped in the 4 years to come.
Thanks a lot. So we have heard a few answers and a lot more questions and dilemmas. But now it's time for you to share your questions and dilemmas. Let's collect a few questions and then answer them. Please introduce yourself before asking the questions so that it would be easier for me to identify those of you who are asking. And if you address your questions to a particular panelist, please mention them, but otherwise I may ask the panelists to answer as they like to answer them. So who will be the first one to answer the question? Or the comment?
Thank you very much. I'm Anita Pellen from the University of Szeged, Hungary. And I would first of all like to thank you for these very interesting and very rich thoughts and insights from various angles. And my question is a general one to this last round. And I'm recognizing some kind of paradox here, because it is being said that Trump is a businessman, that he is operating on a transactional basis, that he gives something and then he wants to receive something. So it's like a business base. And then you are saying and agreeing that because of Trump, now the whole story is turning political. So how do you see this? How does this come together? Thank you.
Another question? As I mentioned, we should collect here. Andrea?
Andrea from Institute of World Economics from here. I have two questions and one comment. Two questions for Mr. Varg, if you can answer that, about SEMCORP. We know about the large battery factories, for example, Samsung, that half of its employees are Asian guest workers. So what is the share in SEMCORP? How many Hungarian, how many guest workers? And the second is that all the other, so far working South Korean factories are working to export. So what will be the SEMCORP's strategy? How many export or Hungarian factory suppliers? Yeah, that's the question. And one comment to agreeing with Mr. Nölke that of course the Germans have no problem with the Hungarian battery factory, because at least they don't function there in Germany. So probably you know what's happened in Rudolstadt and Gera now. So they are actively protesting against battery recycling companies, and the demonstrations. There are tables that will find Ungarn 2, so we don't want to be a second Hungary. So I agree. Thank you.
Probably one more question. Beata?
My name is Beata Farkas, also from the University of Szeged. So I have one half question. So it is partly a comment. So you were talking about China like a rock in the sea, and only seeing how we can navigate around this fantastic stable. So I think it's not a really realistic perspective. So China is shining also from political term with special economic problems and so on, which all have impacts on the relationship with the rest of the world. So this perspective was missing for me. The other comment is that why this de-risking problem. So we have to say that the old nice, I like also this Wandel durch Handel perspective, but it's paid, obviously paid. So, and we must not, or perhaps temporary, so for medium run. So, but now we have to face this issue, and it's a naivety to think that if you or one grows an economic hegemony, it won't be weaponized politically anytime. So I think I agree that Europe is very pessimistic. I participated last week in the Future Battery Forum in Berlin, and I can strengthen this pessimistic mood among the businessmen. But the problem is real in my view. Thank you.
Do we have another question or shall we do the final? Then Gary, one more.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent here. My name is Gary, I'm a junior research fellow here at the World Economy Institute. I have one basic kind of question, I think, but I give you some citations to it, and I read out this question. So first, just to make it clear, I've never heard about de-risking before today. I'm an Africa researcher, so I never heard this term. But I also had this impression that it's hollow, or somehow it's a blurry thing, and I think it's because compared to the decoupling in the US, there is no exact answer for the alternative, like what to do with the alternative. Trump has a clear answer. Decoupling, okay, we close the borders and we focus only in the inland economy, but I don't see this in the de-risking term. And that's why it's a question, what do you see as alternatives? It was partly mentioned, the Gulf states as investors in Europe, or looking for new markets in Australia, 20 million people, or in South America. So this is one point which leads me to the other question that I just realized, like, we never talk about European money, or only European money in China. I mean, I would talk about the German money, but it came to my mind, like, where is the European capital? I mean, this continent was the richest part of the world. It's a very rich part of the world. Where is the European money? And then, of course, I was thinking about, of course, European money is not coming to Europe because the return is not as good as in China or in other countries. And then this is my final question, and I think it's the most important question. Like, what are the implications and consequences of this de-risking from China in terms of redistribution and welfare in Europe? So, to put it in other terms, what's the price for the welfare state model of Europe of the de-risking? Thank you.
Thank you. Then probably that was the final. That was the first round. So we may try to answer all of these questions.
I can start with the first question about the paradox with Trump being a businessman, but this will turn into political. I'd say that for Trump, at least, it seems he views the question as an economic one. He sees like the huge US trade deficit with the rest of the world as like a robbery of the US. That they have somehow been tricked into being the buyer of everybody else's wares, but not producing any of their own. So, of course, I give economists in the panel can probably explain why that is wrong, but that is how Trump views it. And he's turning it political by basically telling other countries that they have to start buying US wares, and it at least has to be balanced. Like the US shouldn't be a huge deficit country in international trade relations. When it comes to some of the other questions, I would say that the term of the de-risking is very unclear, and the reason for that is that the Commission, the European Commission, is trying to thread a needle of not alienating Chinese, basically, to the same degree that the US is doing. So they are basically saying we are going to decouple to some degree, but we are not going to do it in an unfriendly way. They are trying to say like, oh, we're just doing this to be less dependent on third states in general. It hasn't really been received that way in Beijing, and for natural reasons, but that is, of course, why it is so unclear and why they are doing it the way they are. When it comes to European capital and where that is, of course, for instance, if you remember the report by Enrico Letta or Mario Draghi that just came out that are about the competitiveness issues in Europe in general. They, of course, point to this problem. Like there is a huge amount of capital in Europe, but it's basically mostly just standing in the savings accounts of Europeans. And the Capital Markets Union, which is basically a 10-year project that has been going on to try to get these savings into the economy as productive investments, have been going nowhere because there is no unified view within the member companies on how they are supposed to integrate capital markets across the union, how they are supposed to harmonize business law, tax law, all of the things that would be necessary. So capital markets in the union are extremely weak, especially compared to the US, and that is a big problem in general. When it comes to the question of the dependence and weaponization of the Chinese economic, not monopoly, but the dominance in a lot of sectors. Of course, that is what is driving the underlying de-risking effort. There has been, at least since the start of the 2010s, this increasing feeling of the Communist Party in China taking a larger and larger control of the economy in China. And then it's becoming harder to see where Chinese companies start and where the party ends, and how the control is divided. And if this is the case or not is not up to me to say, but at least it's the feeling that a lot of European politicians and EU politicians are driving their actions based on. So they are de-risking, trying to move out of the highly dependent relationships with China, and for instance, critical raw materials or clean tech, because they fear that China, in a situation where it would be wise of them or diplomatically useful, in, for instance, forcing some kind of change in Europe, or for instance, cut off access to critical raw materials, or could use the 5G infrastructure or something, in some nefarious effect. And to some degree, that might be just paranoia, but to another degree, as seen with, for instance, the war in Ukraine and the weaponization of Russian gas, it is also something that you have to take into effect. And you can't just base your trust on third countries and that they would never do anything untoward with the highly dependent relationships. That is the driving event there. I don't know if I answered all the questions, but some of them.
If not all of them, but many.
Let me make it a little personal. I'm really happy to see people from second year of Sweden University, because I'm from there. I still live there, and this is where I start when I go to Debrecen every Monday morning, and this is where I land every Friday night. So it's nice to see people from there. However, since there were two questions, especially addressed to SEMCORP, let me answer those two questions and then leave the other question to the others, so I don't take that much time. SEMCORP is currently having about 350 employees currently, and we haven't started production yet. We are starting production sometime probably mid-December or early next year. It depends on the permits we are receiving from the authorities. We are preparing for mass production now. About half of our employees are expats, expatriates from China, and about half of our employees are Hungarians currently. Our policy is to decrease the number of Chinese employees as fast as possible and increase the Hungarians as fast as possible. And our future plan for the next 3 years is to have a 90 to 10% ratio in favor of Hungarian employees to Chinese. I also have to tell you why is that. It's actually simply economical reasons. And of course, a lot of technology. All of our factories, all the 10 operating SEMCORP factories are in China. This is the first factory which is outside China. Naturally, there are only Chinese experts who know how to set up these machines, how to install these machines, and how to operate these machines, because there are nowhere else, only in China. So this is why we have to bring these experts here to install these machines, to start operating these machines, and to train our Hungarian workforce to learn how to do that. We are also planning to set up a second phase of our factory. There will be even more modern machines, and those machines will also be only understood by our Chinese experts. So they have to stay here to install, to operate, and to keep the Hungarians. But within 3 years from now, by the end of 2027, we want to get to a point when less than 10% of our employees will be Chinese. I also have to tell you that employing a Chinese employee here at SEMCORP costs 4 times more than a Hungarian employee. So this is absolutely not the interest of the company to employ any Chinese employees. It's very, very expensive. First of all, their Chinese salaries are high. We need to pay double salary to them to actually have them come here. So why do that? They live a great life in time. Plus 2 times yearly airplane tickets, return airplane tickets, plus accommodation, 3 times food, daily 3 times. So it, like in general, one Chinese employee costs 4 times more than the same level of employees. That's absolutely no good for us to employ them, but we have to, because they are the only ones who understand this technology. But we hope that in 3 years we can employ almost only Hungarians. At least that's the plan. If your question also refers to do we plan to employ third country nationals, the guest workers, the ones we are employing now, they are expatriates, they are not guest workers. If your question also refers to guest workers, I would say as long as the Hungarian labor market can serve our needs, as long we are not employing any third country citizens, because our economic interest is to have as many Hungarian employees as possible. We are a multicultural environment anyway, and having local employees, this is the most economical solution. This is the safest solution. This is let's say in a multicultural environment, this is the easiest solution. So every interest of the company is to have local Hungarian employees as many as possible. Now, if the labor market around Debrecen city, where we have a huge CNCF factory, huge EV factory, a huge BMW factory, many other factories employing thousands of people, it might happen that the Hungarian labor market will just not be big enough physically to satisfy all those things. Then we will be forced to employ third country citizens, but we are trying our best to avoid that. We are really lucky because we are faster than CAT or EU. But the second question, whether we want to produce our products to sell them outside of Hungary or we have other plans. As SEMCORP is the global market leader in the production and sales of separator films for batteries, the idea of having factories within the European Union is to better serve our European customers. So we will definitely export our products, but mostly within European Union. Like Tesla is also one of our major customers. So we might start exports to the United States, but not for too long, because we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are building our factory in Ohio, United States. So whenever it starts operation, likely next year, second half of next year, that's the way we served from the American factory. Here in Europe, the Hungarian plant is considered the European plant of SEMCORP, and we are planning to serve all our European customers, and that might include the Hungarian factories of these big factory manufacturers. But we start operation earlier than they do. We start earlier, and we will start earlier than they do. So at the moment, almost all of our production is going outside of Hungary, but most of it will stay within European Union. But in a 2-3 year range, we might start supplying CATL, which is literally next door to us, or EV, which is like probably about 15 kilometers. It would be budget-free, and we supply them in China anyway. So that will happen when they start operation.
Well, let me then return to the other questions. Monica, questions about Trump. I mean, one thing that we didn't mention, I think, so far, maybe that helps explain some of our predictions. There is the one issue where the whole US political establishment agrees upon, and that is China has to be kept down. And if the election went the other way, and Harris would have won, with regard to this question, no difference. So the only difference that we have now with Trump is that since Trump has this transactional character, there's a higher degree of, let's say, of chaos, of spontaneous action that is possible. But I think the long run consensus in the US is clearly to keep China down, and there may be some strange actions in between and some turbulences, but there's broad consensus. So Trump is not that important in that regard. Very briefly to Andreas' remark about the battery production in Germany. It's quite interesting. I haven't really heard about this protest, and although we have generally a strong environmental movements in Germany, they really haven't made this a national campaign. So if I read about battery factories in our, let's say, national media, it's still positive. Everybody wants them. This negative the repercussions are really a local issue. But of course, you have a point. Beata's skeptical remarks about the role of China as, you know, the rock of stability. Actually, we may disagree on that. I mean, I have now seen for 20-30 years economic liberals being skeptical about the Chinese economic model, saying, no, it has been successful in the last decades, but now it will collapse. And I have read this over and over and dozens and so on, and it didn't happen. And if I look at the Chinese economic leadership, I can see that they are, unfortunately, show a much wiser approach than our economic leadership. But for example, after the global economic crisis, the Chinese government has realized that a high degree of export dependency is very dangerous. I mean, Germany should have done the same, but they didn't. So China has moved to a domestic investment driven model very heavily in a few years. Then they have realized, oh, we're getting all kinds of overcapacity, so we have to move away from let's say, investment to domestic consumption. Now they're trying to mobilize domestic consumption. So they really have an understanding of macroeconomic processes, and they use the levers. So I think actually they are quite stable because they are. And I hate to see this as a Democrat. They're managing better than we do. About the authoritarian and abundant handle doesn't work. I think basically, in order to solve global problems, we should not care about how other countries organize their political system domestically. I think it's really up to them. If we want to cooperate in order to solve global problems like climate change, we have to accept that some countries have authoritarian political systems, and there's no way around it. And this weaponization, I have to say that I feel for the recent past, the US was far more aggressive in the weaponization of economic structures, of economic institutions than China. I mean, I wouldn't say that if China has the same power position as the US, it wouldn't be operating the same way. You may be right on that. But so far, the US is as aggressive with this. So I think I wouldn't blame China so far. And I'm very, very happy about the question about distributive concerns, because there wasn't nothing at all so far. On your first question, where's the European capital? I don't know where the European capital is, but I can tell you where the German capital is, because Germany has become now, I think that is not widely known, the most unequal country in the whole Eurozone with regard to wealth. So not nothing about social, soziale Marktwirtschaft, forget about it. Germany is the most unequal country now, and the wealth is being held by the owners of German companies, of manufacturing companies. So it's very clear to be identified. And in the past, at least we know where they invested their money in the past, because at least our Anglo-American friends talk about stupid German money. So they have invested in a way that was not very successful. Now, about the distributive consequences of all that we have been discussing so far, I'm afraid that they will be rather negative, because money does not go into, let's say, social services, but in other purposes. It was increase inflation. I mean, if you keep out foreign products, it will increase prices and so on. The only way out is what I proposed before, that we will focus on, let's say, on the European domestic market and domestic consumption. That would be the only way. But again, this would probably not be successful because of Germany. Sorry.
So,
Yeah, so I was going to say, back to follow all right, so I think what order to go in. I suppose I'll start from the first question. I think it's a really good question. It's kind of politics versus economics kind of trade-off. I think again, I realise this is not a nail to the wall academic session here, but I mean, there's been actually an explosion of literature in academic world about state capitalism, and a lot of it a bit critical of it, a lot of it's a bit regurgitated, but it's nonetheless it kind of reflects real world trends in that sense. So to put it another way, the state remains highly important. I mean, there's a reason why he's gone to the presidency for a second time. Well, he campaigned 3 times in a row, so that hasn't happened in a lot of time. So it shows you how important having control over the state practices are for obviously politics, but also economics and the augmentation and recalibration of value chains. So we should do that. And a bit anecdotally, I suppose, there's some famous Hungarian sociologist, I won't mention, because you all know who he is, told me, and I quite like this, that Trump, this is when he was first elected, he's a billionaire first, then he became a politician. Maybe Putin is a billionaire, but it was the other way around. So there are these kind of distinct differences between quote unquote the East and the West, but nonetheless in a kind of in a global sphere, if you like, it's very hard to separate them. And it's hard to say nowadays that one is more kind of important than the other. But it's an important point. So this, to close the circle, I think the state remains very important. Perhaps we did not talk about that enough. I think I wanted to also say kind of China as a rock, yeah, as you mentioned, quite good analogy. I think that I work on this project, and I have 2 Chinese colleagues from mainland China, and it's staggering. It always staggers me how much there is a kind of knowledge imbalance about the West and China. I mean, I'm personally, unfortunately very ignorant of that particular country, and I think that's quite common. There's in European universities there are sinologist departments, as if it's some kind of sort of isolated speciality, where really it should not really be like that. I'm not proposing that universities should restructure themselves, but treating sort of China as a sort of monolithic entity, I think is quite wrong actually, and you end up kind of getting China wrong consistently. So I think that certainly needs addressing. And this imbalance that crosses the culture, language, history, and also political science, which is our own discipline, and many other colleagues in the room as well. So that's that we would all benefit from addressing that imbalance. Or I'm not qualified to propose how we might do that. impact of de-risking on a welfare model. That's quite a good question. I haven't really thought that before. Perhaps because I'm from not through choice, but from a country that has even more inequalities probably than Germany, and the welfare state in that country has been essentially crushed out of existence for the last 45 years. So I don't know how much de-risking would affect that. There is still welfare, obviously, and it does not quite look like the United States in that sense. But it's a good question. I would not. I don't feel quite again qualified to answer it, but I would like to perhaps explore that a little more. I think it's quite interesting. Actually, I might turn the question round. Actually, what's your answer?
I mean, it just came to my mind because obviously we are afraid of China because they are much more competitive, and that's the main point. I think they are more competitive because we live too well. We have we spend a lot of money on social things, on extra pension, on extra holidays. Simply, and that's why I put the question like, what's the price the European welfare state has to pay for de-risking? And I think this is the price we have to live less well. I'm sorry to say that, that's the decision question. Do we want to be de-risked, or we don't want to be de-risked, but then accept the Trojan horse, in our land? Yeah.
We are already or almost behind schedule, but since we started a little later, I'm going to ask if there are any remaining questions and comments, because then we can have a final round.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting to listen to your discussion. I'm Sugimoto Oki from Analyst Japan here. Well, 40 years ago, Japan as an economic animal, it was like China currently. Yeah, it was treated as China currently. And well, from our point of view, China is just next to us, and here is a Taiwanese critical stuff, and we share historical and cultural, geopolitical area, but still, every action of China or Chinese, well, especially government, has some kind of implication of politics. Yeah. And day by day they invade our territory. But I would like to know what for European Union, what is the concrete risk if you have when you are so far from them, from China, and well, I think there is a kind of fear, but what kind of concrete fear do you have? That is, I would like to know. And when it comes to the risky, Japanese companies, they recently, these last several years, they say China +1. It means that, well, we invested a lot, trillions of dollars, I think, in China, but now they see the risk. And also, well, the economy is in recession. So they try to go out from China. Well, they maintain their countries or companies in China, but they try to have another option mainly in India or Southeast Asia. But for Europe, do you have that kind of option? Thank you.
Other question. Okay.
I'm a PhD student in Corvinus University, and I have a collective question of this, because we are saying that we need de-risking from hostile countries and stabilizing the value supply chains. But in my point of view, in many cases, you just putting a middleman. For example, there is a Hungarian company selling parts to China. They are shipping it to Vietnam. and the Chinese owned factory, they build a product and selling it to US and Europe, and many European countries, the companies do the same. So what is the risk in it? Because it's the same risk, but it's more expensive.
One last one, if there's any. WhatsApp?
I'm Marcel Kovács, I'm a student at Corvinus, and you've mentioned the Draghi report and the problem of competitiveness. And my question is, who bears the responsibility of this competitiveness crisis in Europe, and what can the European car manufacturers do to stay competitive worldwide? And is de-risking the solution for it?
So again, the floor is yours. Tough questions, but interesting.
Yeah.
So we don't have a definition, well, we didn't have a definition at the end, at the beginning of this roundtable, probably would land up having a definition.
Let's start out again. First question of what the actual fear is in EU when it comes to China. Of course, it isn't like a security threat in the sense that we are afraid of being invaded from China. But at least from what I can understand, there is one, as we have spoken about, being highly dependent on specific minerals or cars or whatever from China, and that being weaponized during a crisis. And then two, that we are simply outcompeted by China, and which happened, like for instance, with the solar industry, that the whole industry is wiped out in Europe, and that we basically are reduced to installing Chinese produced solar panels or electric vehicles or whatever. That we basically lose all of our capacities in the sort of high value added parts of the value chain. That is really a big problem. Of course, when I mentioned earlier that it might not make sense to speak of overcapacity when it comes to green tech because we need so much of it. But of course, if we only buy it, we lose all of the jobs that are connected to producing it or manufacturing it. And of course, that's going to prove troublesome when you try to sell that to European populace. Of course, we already have seen huge green lashes, that's what it's called, in the European election and a lot of the national elections. And that, of course, is only going to get worse if the green transition only means transition to foreign technology and all the work, jobs being wiped out in Europe. So I think that is a big challenge there as well. When it comes to whose fault it is that Europe isn't competitive, it's not competitive. I think in a sort of broader degree, it comes down to national governments not really investing in basic infrastructure that is really needed. Spoken a lot about it, but the digital infrastructure, energy infrastructure, things that aren't really sexy and not easy to sell to voters. But when it comes down to it, it is really what makes it possible to develop thriving businesses down the line. And of course, also a lack of investment in research and development, stuff like that. And it also, when it comes to specific industries, like for instance, car manufacturing, I think there's been a lot written about it. And of course, it is mainly a German problem. But it seems like they just haven't invested in like the wave of electric vehicles coming, and we have basically fallen a generation behind. So this is both like a national country specific problem and also a problem of European companies not really doing the work to stay up with the technological changes that is coming. We really saw this after the pandemic, where suddenly before the pandemic, Chinese EVs weren't really on the radar and weren't really popular. But then after the pandemic, suddenly European executives and American executives in the auto industry will go to China and be blown away because we are so far behind. And as people say, like before, cars were about like the specific car, but now it's basically just the software and tech, and you build a car around it, but the car isn't the most important part. And we are really anywhere close to the sophistication of the Chinese car companies when it comes to that. So, those are some of the reasons why we are not competitive.
Okay, coming back to your question. First of all, I have to say that we may disagree in one issue. You said that all China's actions, even economical actions, might have some political some political influence. Anyway, I do have a slightly different opinion. I think all China's actions must be economically good. I never seen China do any kind of action where economically it was not advanced for China. I do have actually a lot of discussion on this with people who do not really or just partially understand China's economy. They ask me that probably China is doing a couple of European projects or investments just to say that they have an investment within the European Union, to show that they have an investment in the European Union and they might bring more investments. But this is just simply not true. China never ever does any kind of investment which is not paying off. They always do everything for profit, always. So my opinion is every action might have some political intention behind, but personally, I think every action has a profit intention behind all the time, whatever China does. They never do something just because to be there. And you asked what are our risks, right? Or what are we risking here? I think if we do not cooperate with China technologically, when I say we, I mean European Union, when we do not cooperate with China, if we insist on de-risking or we insist on isolating ourselves and trying to keep it for our own market, this is very dangerous because as we all mentioned, China technologically is ahead of us. And if we do not cooperate with someone who is ahead of us technologically, then we will just fall behind. We are falling behind already. And I think the way out would be more research and development investors in the European technological field. And more cooperation with developed technologies around the world. So I'm not really a big fan of these de-risking ideas. Answer the question: who is responsible for Europe's situation now? In my opinion, basically everybody. Everybody who did not realize that actually China is passing by, and what I see a big part of this responsibility is that European Union is headed for this over-regulating itself. We have so many regulations and laws against everything, and a lot of regulations, and I think it's really over-regulated. We are holding back technological development with all the regulations we have. So this is, I think, one of the reasons. And the second reason is nobody, neither European Union itself nor the individual countries, recognized how fast China is passing by. So basically, everybody is responsible for this. And now I'm afraid it's a little too late, but we probably need to do some actions. But it's definitely not isolating ourselves from the more developed China.
Yeah, I think I can keep it very brief because much has been said already. So on the economic level, I think the difference between Japan and Europe with regard to risking is not as big. I mean, companies have learned in COVID, it's dangerous to have all your supply in one country, so you have maybe China plus one. So that's a harmless thing. I mean, the difference, I think, but maybe it's only talk. I mean, in the European Union, we talk much more on the political level about the risking. And the interesting question, which I cannot answer, is, well, either the US put more pressure on Europe than on Japan for the risking, or there is some kind of self-inflicted European Union discourse on this. I really don't know, but I would suppose that the US would also put pressure on Japan to separate from China, but apparently it doesn't if I listen to you. So I cannot answer that question. On the question who is to blame, my answer is maybe a bit more simple, but of course not so serious as yours. I think you would have to blame Germany or people in Germany for the competitiveness crisis.
You're saying this when not very good German, right?
or including my German, but of course there are different opinions in Germany. So on the one side, it's German business, as we just have heard. I mean, the German car producers collectively did not realize that the car industry is moving in the wrong direction, was making profits on short-term level, was selling the last round of combustion engines without, whereas it had more than enough money to invest in new technologies. I mean, Volkswagen spent, what was it? How many billions in dividends last year? I mean, it's ridiculous. So they would have had, so it's really a business failure on the one side. But then also, let's say, a government failure, because Germany, as you know, after the Eurozone crisis, is a country that tries to impose prudence on the European Union, wants to keep debt down, public expenditure down, including investments in technology and infrastructure. So again, it's Germany. So it's easy to find the countries.
It's just trying to be polite.
All right. And then,
Who's to blame?
yeah, well, I won't blame it all on Germany, especially as I live there, but I get in trouble. But I think, I really like the question: what kind of concrete fear do you have? I think that's really important. I remember having a discussion with colleagues a few years ago about the kind of the Japanese threat in the 1980s. A little bit before my time personally, but there's a lot of literature out there to read. And it's there are some interesting paradoxes there. Didn't last that long, the threat. I don't know enough about the Japanese political economy to talk with any confidence on this topic, but there are some interesting parallels there. And I think it's worthy of more study actually to find out, to dig into that a little bit more. I think what we could broadly call xenophobia is quite an aspect at least EU policy level, but also individual European policy level as well. And I mean Europe, not the EU, because they are not synonymous. I think, and then interconnectedly, I think kind of close the circle, I suppose, to sort of move forward. I think in this de-risking saga, that it will inevitably turn into. I think one way forward from the EU perspective, what it really needs to do is to, and I've mentioned this already, is to kind of treat its own members as members, and not just kind of not have this sort of like implicit tier system of membership in the European Union. I think that would add some sort of cohesion to this topic. And then finally, and this will be quite brief, so I think finally, one thing I wanted to sort of finish on was just to say that, this is the 10th edition of SPOC. So the first one being in 2015. And if you can't, 9 years, so much has happened in that time. It's hard to really digest it. Trump's been elected twice. You never attend 9 years ago, that would have been impossible to call that. So, so, and that's just one, I mean, the long list. So we heard this morning in the opening remarks that hopefully Spock will outlive liberalism. I hope that too. So I don't know, but in the next 9 years, I don't know, but when we're sitting here at the 19th edition, what the world will look like, it's a really open question, but hopefully this so-called de-risking agenda will at least be filled with some content. We'll know a little bit more about that, and we won't all be blaming Germany for everything. And yeah, but let's try to finish on a positive note. So,
Thanks a lot for this positive note. So even more positive note is lunch is already out there. So thanks a lot for all our panelists for their valuable inputs, as well as for all your interesting questions and contributions. So let's go for a lunch and then continue with the following panels at the keynote, which is going to be in this very room at 2 o'clock. Thank you.